This lecture review video examines the age of imperialism and progressivism. It may be helpful to divide this time period into three categories of imperialism, which in many ways is really the foreign policy section for the Gilded Age years and then into the early 20th century. A second category could be the age of progressivism and the attention to domestic reform, and then World War I and American participation. We'll start first with a discussion of American imperialism. By the mid and late 19th century, it is clear the United States, after securing its borders of what will become the lower 48 states, start to set its attention overseas and start to look for new paths for expansion, particularly overseas. We've already examined how the idea of manifest destiny was instrumental in expanding Americans across the North American continent from sea to shining sea. And now a new manifest destiny becomes popular at the end of the 19th century, which encouraged the spread of American institutions, particularly capitalism, constitutionalism, and Christianity, to the far reaches of the globe. Thus, for the first time in its history, the United States becomes an empire with colonies that extend far into the Pacific and then also into the Caribbean. There are many motivations for this new age of imperialism: the new manifest destiny, an attention to missionary activity and dispatching American Christian missionaries around the globe, a desire for foreign markets to buy American manufactured goods, the yellow press, that sensationalized press that exaggerated stories around the world, also was an inducement to expansion. Also, the need for naval stations where U.S. ships could be resupplied with coal and continue on their journeys is also a motivation, as well as competition with other nations, the quest for natural resources, and also ideas of social Darwinism, which were fed by the poem The White Man's Burden. A significant change takes place in late 19th century American foreign policy that at last, Great Britain and the United States are no longer enemies. Of course, it was against Great Britain that the United States had fought for its independence. It also fought another war in the War of 1812. And there also seemed to be a moment in the Civil War with the Trent Affair, and it looked like the United States might go to war against Great Britain again. But realizing that their markets and their interests were the same, the United States and Great Britain engaged in what becomes known as the Great Rapprochement in the late 19th century, in which the special relationship, as it's often called, becomes a guiding principle of American foreign policy of the 20th century, that Great Britain is always the Americans' best friend when it comes to international affairs. A significant set of speeches were delivered by Alfred Thayer Mahan at the Naval War College, also advocating for imperialism. This collection of lectures was eventually put together and published in a book called The Influence of Sea Power Upon History. And in this series of lectures, Alfred Thayer Mahan advocated for the importance of imperialism, creating colonies, also naval stations, but most importantly, the construction of a large navy. He points out that all great empires that last for any point of time in history were heavily dependent on sea power. Thus, this leads to a great age of naval construction for the United States. It is also at the end of the late 19th century that the United States acquires the two territories that will eventually become the 49th and 50th states. This includes the Hawaiian Islands. The Hawaiian Islands, located far out in the Pacific, was a set actually of hundreds of islands that were ruled by a monarchy. King Kalakaua was the king of the Hawaiian Islands and had actually been the first guest at the first state dinner held at the White House by President Grant during his administration. But after the king's death, eventually a constitution is imposed on the Hawaiian monarchy by local officials, particularly American merchants, that demand a limit to the monarch's power and also an expansion of trading rights. Therefore, seeing the opportunity when the king's sister came to the throne, Queen Liliuokalani, who certainly wasn't initially disposed towards the American merchants, a group of Americans launch a revolution in Hawaii and topple the queen from her throne, depose her, then establish Hawaii as an independent republic. This Hawaiian revolution is supported by 162 sailors by the USS Boston, in which the sailors land and then occupy the grounds of the Palace of Hawaii, declaring the new Republic of Hawaii. Thus, this is often called the Pineapple Revolution, and we see the Hawaiian flag being lowered, and then later on in 1898, the Hawaiian Islands are annexed to the United States, but will not become a state until 1959. Alaska is the other territory acquired by the United States in the 19th century to later become one of the 50 states. Alaska, to the far reaches of the Northwest, was generally considered uninhabitable and of little value. Everyone knew that the territory of Alaska was teeming with wildlife, and the Russians actually were some of the first to colonize areas of Alaska. But it is in 1867 that the Secretary of State, William Seward, Abraham Lincoln's Secretary of State, begins the purchase of Alaska. This purchase of Alaska was for $7.2 million paid to the Russian government. That represents less than 2 cents per acre. That was a better price than what the United States had even achieved in the Louisiana Purchase. The Russians were motivated to sell Alaska because they feared the British were going to seize it anyway, and they were enjoying few profits from it. The Americans were motivated to purchase it, not only for territorial expansion, but also anticipating the discovery of gold and also establishing new far-off Pacific ports. Now, Seward is heavily criticized for the purchase of Alaska. Indeed, it was called Seward's Folly and Seward's Icebox. And initially, it didn't seem like the American investment would pay off. But of course, later on, with gold rushes in the late 19th century and early 20th century, yielded some profits. But even more valuable was the discovery of large, vast quantities of oil, particularly in the northern part of Alaska, known as Prudhoe Bay, which will eventually lead to the construction of the Alaskan Pipeline and enormous oil reserves and profits for the United States. At the very end of the 19th century, American foreign policy is really focused on events in Cuba. This is going to lead to American involvement in another war against Spain, the Spanish-American War. For much of the second half of the 19th century, Cubans had been involved in a war of independence, a revolution against Spanish authority. You remember that Cuba was one of those very old Spanish colonies that had been established during the Age of Discovery. But as Spain and its empire had been in decline for hundreds of years, the oppression and the poor administration of the Cubans had become very acute by the end of the 19th century. Therefore, seeking their freedom, they had launched numerous wars of independence against Spanish authorities. The Spanish government, and particularly the Spanish military under the command of General Valeriano Weyler, had really enacted a policy of brutality and fierce punishment, so much so that Weyler would become known as Butcher Weyler in the American press. Those that had rebelled against Spanish authority, particularly many of the Cuban peasants, were concentrated in what we would somewhat identify as concentration camps, or what were called reconcentrados, reconcentrating rebels into these camps for a better control of the population. Of course, the conditions of these camps are absolutely deplorable, and it leads to 200,000 deaths of Cubans from starvation and disease on their way to independence. Events in Cuba are being monitored and published and sensationalized in the American press due to a very great competition between two major newspaper magnates in their quest for additional newspaper sales. This is Joseph J. Pulitzer and William Randolph Hearst. These two editors, in great competition with each other, enact what becomes nicknamed the Yellow Press because their newspapers were published on yellow paper. Yellow Press becomes a nickname for very sensationalized, exaggerated, almost tabloid-like journalism. And so there, of course, were many atrocities in Cuba accomplished by the Spanish, but all of these are often exaggerated and certainly over-dramatized in much of the American press, inflaming American opinion against Spanish authorities and, of course, leading to a greater drumbeat towards war. A pivotal event occurs when the USS Maine is dispatched by the United States Navy to Havana Harbor. The Maine is there to protect American citizens in the course of the Cuban Wars for Independence and is just anchored in Havana Harbor. But yet, on the night of February 15th, 1898, the Maine suddenly explodes in Havana Harbor. The explosion leads to the death of 266 sailors, and only a survival or a portion of the crew. Immediately, there are accusations that Spain intentionally blew up the Maine with a harbor mine. Indeed, a congressional investigation is launched, but no definitive evidence is ever identified to prove that accusation. Nevertheless, the press sensationalizing this event leads to the chant, "Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain," and there are even greater calls to go to war against Spain and avenge the dead American sailors that were aboard the USS Maine, that the newspapers continue to drum up. Also, a key event inflaming American opinion against Spain was the Dupuy-Delaune letter. Delaune was the Spanish ambassador to the United States, and in a secret piece of correspondence with the foreign minister of Spain, Delaune said some very derogatory things about the American president, William McKinley. He called him weak and said that he catered to the rabble or the crowd, and called him a low politician who gave in to the worst elements of his party. That letter is intercepted and also put into the American press, and Americans are insulted that their American president had been insulted. And therefore, with great enthusiasm, Congress calls for a declaration of war against Spain in 1898. The Spanish-American War has a hidden value in it that this is the first war fought after the American Civil War, when the North and South were divided and killing each other. Now, the two sides, of course, will be unified to go fight this war against Spain. Ironically, at some points during the war, sometimes Northern commanders would call their Southern officers the enemy, hearkening back to the Civil War. Immediately, once war is declared, Commodore George Dewey launches his fleet against another Spanish colony in possession, but far off in the Pacific, the Philippine Islands. And Dewey uses his ships to go into Manila Bay and suddenly shell and destroy the Spanish fleet. Therefore, the decrepit old Spanish fleet was really a bunch of junks anyway, are quickly destroyed in Manila Bay, rendering them unusable for the remainder of the war against the Americans. Thereafter, U.S. troops also occupied the capital city of the Philippines, Manila, and begin pushing out Spanish authorities in the islands. The Americans also move against another Spanish colony in the Pacific. This is Guam, and very quickly in June of 1898 capture the island of Guam. The Spanish governor on the island wasn't even aware that the war was on between Spain and the United States. As a result, a call goes out for U.S. Army volunteers. There is no draft for the Spanish-American War, but rather there are only 25,000 men in the regular army. Very quickly, 220,000 volunteer for service, 100,000 the very first night after the explosion of the Maine. One of those who volunteers for service and resigns his position as Assistant Secretary of the Navy is Theodore Roosevelt. He is given a commission as a colonel of a cavalry regiment that, of course, famously becomes known as the Rough Riders, comprised of cowboys and ranchers, boxers, even a polo and a tennis champion, as well as some Native American fighters. Therefore, the Rough Riders and other units load up, particularly at the port of Tampa, then sail down to Cuba. There's inadequate room on the ships for the horses of the Rough Riders, so in reality, most of the Rough Riders are actually walking across Cuba. They land on the island and then endeavor to take key positions around the city of Santiago, including the San Juan Heights, which include San Juan Hill and also Kettle Hill. This is, of course, where Theodore Roosevelt leads his famous charge, not up San Juan Hill, but Kettle Hill, which was part of the San Juan Heights. And so, at great risk to himself, he rallies the American troops to run up the hill and to destroy these pillboxes with gun emplacements and take the hill. Thereafter, the city of Santiago is very easy to capture for the Americans, and it really signals the effective end of the war. There is also a campaign on the island of Puerto Rico in which General Nelson Miles, who had made a reputation as an Indian fighter in the American West, also commands troops to take the island of Puerto Rico declaring it an American possession. The Americans in the course of the Spanish-American War actually lose more men to yellow fever and malaria than they do to Spanish bullets. Spain really never provided itself as a formidable ally, and therefore the war is over very quickly with the signing of a peace treaty in Paris of 1898, in which the United States obtained the Spanish former colonies of the Philippines, Guam, and Puerto Rico. Cuba does not become a U.S. colony, but it does become a United States protectorate. It gains its independence from Spain, and as a protectorate, it had independence, but the United States would really control its foreign policy. Those provisions are solidified with the Platt Amendment, an amendment later on to the treaty, in which Cuba would not make any treaty that weakens its independence. Cuba would allow the United States to buy or lease naval stations, including the famous naval station at Guantanamo Bay. And Cuba's public debt should not exceed its ability to pay, and the United States would have the right to intervene in Cuba anytime it felt necessary. The Platt Amendment and the United States controlling Cuba as a protectorate is going to lead to 50 years of antagonism and resentment by many Cuban leaders against the United States, and eventually will lead to the rise of Fidel Castro in the late 1950s, the communist leader of Cuba. After the war with Spain is over, the war against the Filipinos actually continues in the Philippines for many years to come. Many of the Filipinos did not want to replace Spanish authority with American authority, so therefore many of the Filipinos launch a war of ambush and attack and resistance for the independence of the Philippines, led by Emilio Aguinaldo. Aguinaldo is very essential in rallying the Filipinos to fight the Americans, but in the end, American firepower is much greater than that of the Filipinos, and eventually the Philippines are subdued and become an American colony and will continue to do so right up through World War II. Other acquisitions of the United States during this time period also include the Samoan Islands. The Samoan Islands also provide a valuable coaling station for the United States in the middle of the Pacific. The United States is also focused on events transpiring in Asia. At this time, the European powers are busy conducting a very vigorous trade, particularly with China. And there is great concern that China will be divided up into various colonies, just as the continent of Africa had been done by England and France and Germany and the Belgians. Therefore, the United States endeavors to intervene to prevent China from being broken up into colonies and provides guidelines for the future of trade with China called the open door policy. It's called the open door because China will remain as one cohesive country. It'll maintain its territorial integrity, but there can be spheres of influence or trading zones in which each European power can exercise exclusive interest in ports for trade. Thus, this prevents China being broken up. Now, there is great resentment within China, particularly against foreign Christian missionaries, but also foreign merchants. This leads to the emergence of the Boxers, which was a secret martial arts society that was dedicated to killing and driving out foreigners. Indeed, across China, hundreds of thousands of missionaries and merchants and fellow Chinese who were accused of conspiring with Westerners against China are all brutally beheaded and murdered in their villages. Eventually, many of the Europeans are forced to retreat behind the walls of the Forbidden City, and there the Boxers surround them in the city of Peking, now Beijing, and it requires American, British, German, and French troops being dispatched in order to rescue them and break the siege surrounding the Forbidden City. The significance of the Boxer Rebellion for United States foreign policy is that clearly the United States is getting involved on the world stage like never before. There was also resentment on the West Coast against Asian and particularly Chinese settlers. We see that in the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, whereas popular resentment, particularly inflamed by the Irish immigrant Dennis Kearney, leads to the refusal of additional Chinese migration to the West Coast and a bitter legacy of racism against Asian settlers. We also see it in the Gentleman's Agreement of 1907, between the United States and Japan, which also blocked further Japanese migration to the United States. We can now look to the foreign policies of the significant progressive presidents that we'll discuss in a moment. That would include Theodore Roosevelt, who's best known for his big stick diplomacy based on a supposed African proverb, in which the United States should be firm and strong, but yet still seek peace. The United States is, of course, instrumental in the construction of the Panama Canal. A canal between the oceans had been the vision and the dream for a long time. Some envisioned going through Nicaragua, and then later, the course through Panama is considered to be the best. The French had tried in this effort to construct the canal, but had spent vast amounts of money and had resulted in 22,000 deaths in the process of starting the canal, and therefore the company goes bankrupt and the French give up. The United States purchases the rights to the canal and foments a rebellion of the Panamanians which against the Colombian government. At that time, the Isthmus of Panama was part of the country of Colombia and frequently sought its independence, which in the past the United States had opposed. But now, because Colombia refuses to sell the rights and the land to the United States for the construction of the canal, the United States, under the leadership of Theodore Roosevelt, encourages a rebellion of the Panamanians to declare their own country. Once they do so, they are supported by U.S. naval ships. Colombia can do nothing. They get nothing out of the deal, but Panama accepts the proposed deal and indeed gets $10 million plus $250,000 each year as a lease price for access to the canal zone. Theodore Roosevelt comes down to inspect the construction of the canal. He'll be the first president to ever leave the United States while in office. Thus, the canal is built through the Isthmus of Panama using a series of lakes and also locks. It is the design of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers under the command of George Washington Goethals. And it is also very important that American military doctors solve the problem of mosquitoes and malaria in Panama. It is William Crawford Gorges and also Walter Reed who are instrumental in driving out much of the mosquito population and also reducing the threat of malaria. Thereafter, the United States is able to build its canal and begin its construction using large steam shovels and also railways to remove vast amounts of dirt and rock. And then finally, the canal begins to open in 1914 with the SS Ancon as the first ship to pass through the famous canal. Theodore Roosevelt is also instrumental in amending the Monroe Doctrine by issuing the Roosevelt Corollary. This was an addendum to the Monroe Doctrine, which said that European powers could not intervene in Caribbean finances. This was provoked by the Venezuelan crisis, in which Venezuela owed large debts to the British and Germans, and the British and Germans threatened to invade Venezuela. Therefore, Theodore Roosevelt intervenes and says only the United States had the right to intervene in Latin American affairs and would oversee the collection of customs duties to pay off Venezuela's debts. The Treaty of Portsmouth was also negotiated by Theodore Roosevelt, which led to an end to the Russo-Japanese War. The Russo-Japanese War signaled the rise of Japan as a major military and particularly naval power, and also the decline of Tsarist Russia, the United States playing the role of the broker and the mediator in the conflict. Theodore Roosevelt also launched the Great White Fleet, which is instrumental in showing off new American naval power. It sailed around the world and was really an example of the United States flexing its new muscle. William Howard Taft, as the second progressive president, was known for his dollar diplomacy, which encouraged investment overseas. We see this in the expansion of the United Fruit Company, which often purchased much land in Caribbean nations for a very low price and then reaped large profits in the growth in the production of tobacco or sugar or bananas or pineapple. And then usually these republics form great resentment against the United Fruit Company, and it leads to conflict, or what become known as the Banana Wars, in which often U.S. Marines are dispatched to these states to protect American interests and also the interests of the American Fruit Company. Then finally, Woodrow Wilson, as the third progressive president, is known for his famous moral diplomacy, in which the United States would be a moral force almost preach a sense of self-righteousness to the rest of the world. Under Wilson's administration, the United States purchases the Danish West Indies, which become the U.S. Virgin Islands. And the United States also launches a feudal expedition to arrest and imprison Pancho Villa. Pancho Villa was a Mexican bandit who had repeatedly crossed the U.S. border, attacking U.S. settlements in the midst of the chaos of yet another Mexican revolution. A group of Army officers, including General John Pershing and also a very young Lieutenant George S. Patton, are sent across the border to hunt down Pancho Villa, but that expedition ends in failure. There are those that oppose this new age of imperialism in the United States, become known as the Anti-Imperialism League. They protested American involvement in the acquisition of colonies as a fundamental betrayal of American identity. But generally, it is those that support the expansion of the United States that win the argument over the course of the 19th century, and many of the accomplishments of the American military at this time are celebrated in the music and in the marches of John Philip Sousa. Let's move now to a discussion of progressivism. We can date the age of progressivism as really starting at the end of the 19th century, but particularly evident at the beginning of the 20th century in these years all the way up to 1920. The age of progressivism was an age of reform, attention to reform, that the United States had grown rapidly, perhaps too fast in the Gilded Age, and there were many social problems that needed the attention of the government to be reformed after the conclusion of the Gilded Age. These include the power of Gilded Age trusts, in which there's widespread sentiment that companies like Standard Oil had become far too large, and that the robber barons were really prospering on the backs of the working man, and that these robber barons had too much influence over the national government, even controlled the federal government. The Populist Party of the late 19th century was also an important predecessor of the progressive movement, and also the labor conflicts of the Gilded Age, including the Homestead Strike, the Great Railroad Strike, the Pullman Strike, and also the Haymarket Square riot. Progressivism was also inspired by the needs of the cities, and particularly Gilded Age urbanization, which had witnessed the quick expansion of American cities and a lot of congestion, crime, dirt, filth, disease in the cities, and also child labor in major American industries. Also in American industries, we see numerous industrial accidents because of the lack of regulations and the lack of safety concerns and working conditions for the working man. All of these are motivations, causes for the progressive movement. Some of the more notable industrial accidents, including the Ashtabula train disaster in 1876, in which a train went over a bridge in Ohio outside of Cleveland, and the bridge collapsed, killing many people on board. And then also the very famous Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, in which young girls were making shirtwaists in this very crowded factory floor. And when there are no safety precautions, no fire drills, no extinguishers, even the exit door is locked, there are no fire escapes, and as a result, unfortunately, a fire breaks out and very quickly consumes those working on the floor of this building. The fire preparedness of the city of New York is, of course, very much lacking. People are forced to jump from the windows to their death. It takes a long time to put the fire out, and when it is all said and done, there are many victims of the fire, including 123 women and 23 men. The other major notable disaster or industrial accident of the early 20th century, of course, was the sinking of the RMS Titanic. The Titanic was the most luxurious ship of the time and was prophesied to be unsinkable because of its bulkhead compartments. But then, of course, the Titanic strikes an iceberg and sinks in the middle of the North Atlantic. And as a result, there are only 20 lifeboats that could accommodate 1,178 people aboard, despite the fact that there were 2,208 aboard the Titanic. This leads to new regulations regarding shipping and also passenger ships, but also the need for lifeboats to be mandatory aboard ships. We also see a disaster in Boston with the Summer Street Bridge disaster, in which a streetcar in 1916 fell off a bridge and brought everybody into the water with them. And as a result of the disaster, Many people are killed and drowned inside the streetcar. Also in Boston, we have the famous Boston Molasses disaster, in which a very large molasses tank that was filled to capacity on an unusually warm day explodes on the north end of Boston, and 2.3 million gallons of molasses traveling at 25 in a 25-foot high wave at 35 miles an hour cascades throughout the north end of Boston, destroying buildings and also overhead elevated railways. And in the end, 21 are killed and 150 injured. To make matters even worse, after World War I, we see the development of the Spanish flu pandemic. This pandemic probably begins in the trenches of World War I and quickly spreads worldwide. And as a result, 50 to 100 million people are killed. That represented 3 to 5% of the world's population are killed in the Great Spanish Flu pandemic. Other motivations for the age of progressivism could also be Gilded Age Christianity. We can divide Gilded Age Christianity into evangelicals and liberals. Evangelicals included the hymn writer Fanny Crosby and also the revivalist Dwight Moody. Dwight Moody, who originally from Massachusetts, moves to Chicago and creates famous Sunday schools that targeted young orphaned or abandoned boys on the streets. The Great Fire of Chicago destroys much of his ministry, and Dwight Moody begins a career as a revivalist and then travels also to Europe, conducting large revivals, calling people to repent of their sins and trust in Christ as their Savior. He's also the founder of the Moody Bible Institute with his famous hymn singer, Ira Sankey. We also see in the evangelical wing of Gilded Age Christianity the emergence of Pentecostalism. Pentecostalism emerges particularly in the Azusa Street revival of Los Angeles. Another famous preacher of the Gilded Age Christianity was Henry Ward Beecher, the famous son of Lyman Beecher, who held a large church in Brooklyn, New York. Phillips Brooks conducted a congregation in Boston. We also see the emergence of more radical or more liberal wings of Christianity, including the emergence of Christian Science under the inspiration of Mary Baker Eddy and the publication of her book, Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures. More liberal Christian theology emerges in Germany and comes to the United States. This was met with great concern in the United States by American evangelicals, as liberal Christianity targeted the authority of the Bible and rejected the divinity of Jesus Christ and also the atonement and the miracles of Christ as well. It really seemed to shorn Christianity of its fundamental miracles and theological underpinnings. Charles Sheldon publishes his famous book, In His Steps. Walter Rauschenbusch is the founder of a much more liberal form of Christianity known as the social gospel. In his book, Rauschenbusch said Christianity primarily is not about the saving of souls, but it's about the saving of lives. And particularly, the kingdom of God needs to be built on earth through social reform and clothing the naked and feeding the hungry and healing the sick. All of these are reasons for the emergence of progressivism in the early 20th century. There's also a series of very notable journalists who are active in the United States that expose corruption and inefficiency in government and the oppressive nature of the trust system and the difficulties of the working man in living in American cities. These journalists become known as Muckrakers, given the title by Theodore Roosevelt, and published their editorials in major American magazines at the time. They become known as the Progressives. Progressives advocated for progress. They weren't opposed to progress, but they believed that government and reform and society needed to progress as long with industry and additional inventions. Many of the progressives have very much a socialist undertone to them, and indeed there is a growing, strong socialist party of the United States at the turn of the century, inspired by authors like Edward Bellamy, who wrote Looking Backward, and also John Spargo. But the most famous socialist at turn of the century America was Eugene V. Debs. Debs had been instrumental in organizing the Pullman strike, and he also runs for president numerous times, including once from jail, capturing 400,000 votes in the election of 1912. Some of those socialist ideas seem to come to a reality in the passage of the 16th Amendment to the Constitution in 1913. The 16th Amendment will become one of the significant progressive amendments. So we've already seen that there are the Civil War amendments to the Constitution, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. And now we will see that there are 4 progressive amendments, the 16th, the 17th, the 18th, and the 19th Amendments. The 16th Amendment gave power to Congress for the first time in U.S. history to levy an income tax. The tax was only directed against the nation's highest earners, but gradually the income tax is expanded to lower income levels. The progressives had a whole series of ideas and targets that they sought for reform. There were reform ideas regarding bank fraud, child labor, chronic unemployment, and also the conspicuous consumption of the rich. Some of the more famous progressives, including Ida Tarbell, who published The History of the Standard Oil Company. This exposed just how aggressive the competition Rockefeller launched against his competitors for the creation of the Standard Oil Company, and only added to the great distrust and hatred the public had for Standard Oil and also John D. Rockefeller himself. Lincoln Steffens was also a very famous progressive who wrote a very famous series of articles called The Shame of the Cities. In these series of articles, Steffens visited numerous municipalities in the United States and exposed just how corrupt they were and how business interests were often trump safety interests in the cities. And there's an enormous system of bribes and kickbacks in so many municipalities in the United States. Jacob Riis, a Danish reformer and progressive, published the very consequential How the Other Half Lives. In this book, he exposed the deplorable living conditions of so much of the working class in America's major cities. The publication of How the Other Half Lives was aided by the invention of magnesium flash powder, which provided flash photography for the first time to expose the dirty, filthy, crowded conditions that many immigrants and members of the working class lived in day after day in America's cities. Another significant and consequential expose of American life included that published by Theodore Dreiser. Theodore Dreiser published Sister Carrie, which told the story of a tale of a woman who gradually descends from high society to the lower end, suggesting that this could happen to any of the wealthier elements of society and that the need for reform was very much present. Samuel Hopkins Adams publishes a consequential piece in The Great American Fraud. Adams exposed how dangerous so many of the American medicines being peddled were actually poisoned and making people sicker, and called for reform, regulation, and truth in labeling for most of the medicines and food that Americans were consuming. John H. Kellogg revives the diet and health movement of the antebellum reform movement and encourages improved health, and also introduces his cornflakes to fight against constipation. Upton Sinclair published The Jungle. The Jungle exposed the meatpacking industry in Chicago and just how the lack of safety regulations led to often disease and the meat being corrupted and unsuitable for eating, and called for inspection of America's meat-producing plants. Frank Norris Jr. published The Octopus, which exposed the aggressive nature of the railroad industry and how much political influence railroad magnates exercised over the federal government. David Graham Phillips published The Treason of the Senate and exposed the very close and improper relationship between the United States senators and major business leaders. Phillips called for members of the United States Senate not to be elected by state legislatures, but rather by the population, by the people, and thus hoping to reduce the amount of corruption in government. That idea was eventually placed into the Constitution in the form of the 17th Amendment, which thereafter, for the first time in American history, United States senators were elected directly by the people and not by state legislatures. Like the antebellum reform movements, there's also attention to mental health reform and also prison reform. We see that in the works of Nellie Bly in the 10 Days in a Madhouse, and also Julius Chambers in A Mad World. Helen Hunt Jackson exposed the corruption and the unfair treatment by the federal government towards Native American tribes in A Century of Dishonor. Also, an issue that caught the attention of progressive reformers was the Jim Crow South, this pattern and the society of segregation that predominated through much of the American South, which included the system of convict leasing, which was really slavery by a different name, in which blacks who had been accused of minor crimes were forced to pay for their sentences and long work sentences, serving as part of work crews, and could even be leased out to employers. We also see the rapid growth of lynching throughout the South, in which blacks are accused and then executed of crimes that they may or may not have been committed and not given a fair trial. The Supreme Court seems to endorse the Jim Crow culture of the South in a very important decision in 1896 known as Plessy v. Ferguson. The Plessy v. Ferguson case was actually about the segregation of rail cars, but the decision gets applied most notably to schools across the country, in which it became constitutional for the establishment of white schools and black schools based on the premise that they could be separate as long as the schools were equal. Of course, black schools throughout the South were nowhere near equal in quality and education as the white schools. Ray Stannard Baker was also another progressive reformer. He was one of the first to call for equality in writing an important piece called Following the Color Line, an account of Negro citizenship in the American democracy. Baker was one of the first to call for racial justice and racial equality, which was an idea particularly extraordinary for the time. Ida Wells was also a black female progressive who exposed the practice of lynching throughout the South in her book Southern Horrors, Lynch Law in All Its Phases, and called for reform. Booker T. Washington is probably the most notable black reformer of the progressive era. He had been born into slavery and then wrote his autobiography, Up From Slavery, an autobiography by Booker T. Washington. The premise of Washington's book and of his ideas was that blacks can progress in society, improve their lot in life, not by demanding civil rights from whites, but rather by simply getting educated and working hard. They should accept the racist system of the Jim Crow South and simply work hard to improve their lot in life. To that end, he establishes Tuskegee University, which was one of the premier black schools of the South, and encouraged education of African Americans. He issues the very famous The Atlanta Compromise in 1895, in which a tacit agreement was formed between whites and blacks in the South, that Southern blacks would work and submit to white political rule without demanding the end of segregation, and Southern whites promised to grant basic education and due process to blacks and also fund educational charities. Indeed, Booker T. Washington at one point is invited to the White House to meet with President Theodore Roosevelt. W.E.B. Du Bois is the other famous black progressive of the early 20th century and was a very vocal critic of the approach of Booker T. Washington. Du Bois believed it was wrong for Washington to advocate the acceptance of the segregation system and called for an immediate disbursement of civil rights to black Americans. His important work, The Souls of Black Folk, advocated for immediate civil rights for blacks now. It should be granted by white society. Du Bois was instrumental in the founding of the Niagara Movement, which leads to the creation of the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, one of the premier institutions in the country advocating for the rights of blacks today. Du Bois called for a talented a tenth portion of the African American population that would be well educated, well trained, and well motivated to secure civil rights for the rest of African Americans. Another progressive reformer in the area of education was John Dewey, who advocated a more student-centered form of learning and also learning by doing. Temperance makes another return as another significant progressive reform movement. The Anti-Saloon League is formed in 1893. This becomes the political arm of the temperance movement and became very effective in coercing congressmen and senators to vote for temperance legislation. Carrie Nation took her progressive reform for temperance to an even greater level, even exercising violence, smashing saloons and the liquor bottles that she went in throughout the Midwest. Thus, with the creation of the Anti-Saloon League, we finally see the success of the temperance movement with the adoption in 1919 of the 18th Amendment to the Constitution, which banned the production and sale of alcoholic beverages except for medicinal and religious purposes. This led to the Great Age of Prohibition throughout the 1920s. Jane Addams is definitely probably the most famous female progressive. She was famous for the creation of the Hull House in Chicago and then other additional Hull Houses across the country, which particularly looked to protect battered women, also immigrant women who were widows, or those young girls that were found on the streets, giving them a place to live and also some job training. Anthony Comstock tackled some of the vice of the cities as the New York postal inspector. He created the New York Society for the Suppression of Vice and particularly targeted areas of prostitution in major American cities, particularly New York, but also the publication of pornographic materials. Indeed, the Comstock Act of 1873 made it a federal crime for the U.S. Postal Service to send items or any literature about obscenity, contraceptives, or items to provoke abortion, sex items, personal letters with any sexual content throughout the mail. This was part of a larger progressive movement called the Social Purity Movement that particularly targeted brothels and prostitution, which was rampant in American cities, including areas of Boston such as Ann Street, and particularly the lower south side of Chicago, where the famous brothel, the Everleigh Club, was run by Etta and Minna Everleigh on the south side of Chicago. We also see a new attention to the issue of women during the progressive era. Indeed, many progressives were women themselves, and the premier issue for the progressive movement was female suffrage. This movement was led by the capable suffragists of Carrie Chapman Catt and also Alice Paul and Lucy Burns. Indeed, in the midst of World War I, there are large protests outside of the White House calling for the right of women to have the right to vote. Many of these so-called silent sentinels are arrested, and individuals such as Alice Paul are force-feeded to end their hunger strikes that they were conducting in prison to attract attention to their cause. Nevertheless, the efforts of the suffragettes is finally achieved with the adoption in 1920 of the 19th Amendment, which for the first time gave women the right to vote. Another consequential female progressive was Margaret Sanger. Margaret Sanger was concerned about the number of children that immigrant women bore, often putting their own health at risk and unable to feed all of these children, and therefore was a strong advocate for birth control, creating the American Birth Control League, which was a predecessor to Planned Parenthood. She also becomes a very vocal advocate of abortion and right to access a free abortion, and also was a firm believer in eugenics, believing that some races and peoples needed to be eliminated from the bloodline, promoting a healthier, stronger society. Indeed, the eugenics movement is kind of the dark underbelly of the progressive movement, a part of the movement that we don't like to discuss today because it advocated for racial cleansing and the elimination of inferior races from the bloodline. Indeed, there are thousands of women, particularly poor African American women, who are forcibly sterilized against their will so that they would not be able to breed in the future. But the eugenics movement represents a more radical or extreme version of the progressive reform movement that was much more consistent with the anarchist movement, which is significant at the turn of the century under the leadership of Emma Goldman. Eventually, Emma Goldman will be deported from the United States for what is perceived as her revolutionary activities. We also see a nascent environmental movement as part of the progressives under the leadership of John Muir and the creation of the Sierra Club. Indeed, there is a debate of the early environmental movement of should the movement advocate conservation, which is the wise use of resources, or should it promote preservation, which is leaving the wilderness untouched and not harnessing its natural potentials. Therefore, all of these ideas that are being published in the nation's newspapers and magazines and in books and in speeches and conferences and assemblies and so forth eventually make their way into law, first at the local level, then at the state level, and then at the federal level. And so when we talk about local and state progressivism, we can see the introduction of such consequential ideas as the direct primary, in which the people themselves could nominate those who will run for office, and the candidate would not simply be a lackey of larger political machines, party bosses, or of corporate interests. And also the initiative in which the people themselves could write a law, and if they got enough signatures, it indeed would become a law. It was a way to circumvent and avoid legislatures of the states that were often seen as corrupt and in the pocket of corporate interests. And also the referendum, in which the people, after the legislature had passed a law, could vote on that law and decide if it indeed would go into force. And also the recall, in which after the people had elected a candidate to office, such as a governor, that candidate, if he was not performing well, could be recalled, removed from office even before the end of his term. Some more famous local and state level progressives included the senator from Wisconsin, Robert La Follette. Battling Bob was famous in Wisconsin for making Wisconsin one of the premier laboratories for progressivism, including lowering railroad rates, raising railroad taxes, improving education, encouraging conservation, factory regulation, workmen's compensation, and also creating the first direct primary in the country, as well as imposing the first state income tax. Hiram Johnson was the progressive governor of California who advocated the direct primary initiative. Referendum and recall are all introduced in California, and also created a state's railroad commission to curb the interests of the railroads, supported conservation, and also signed a new employer's liability law. Tom Johnson was the popular mayor of Cleveland, and on the municipal level, reduced Cleveland streetcar fares because it said it was unfair for the working man to pay so much in order to get to work, and also supported the referendum recall initiative and also municipal ownership of public utilities. These progressive ideas emerge in the minds and in the publications of the progressives, make their way to local reform, then state level, and then, of course, the national level. The national progressive movement is dominated by three consequential presidents. The first, of course, is Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt is really the first major 20th century president. He had endured great loss in his early life, including the death of his mother and first wife, on the same day. He flees to the Badlands, where he becomes a rancher for a brief period of time, remarries, and fathers several children. Eventually, he becomes the New York City police commissioner, cleaning up the police force and enforcing a stricter code of conduct. He becomes Assistant Secretary of the Navy and is instrumental in the United States during the Spanish-American War, of course serving as leader of the Rough Riders who led their famous charge up San Juan Hill. Coming back to the United States as a war hero, he is elected governor of New York, but he will not serve long in New York, and indeed he angers the party boss, Thomas Platt, who controlled the political machine in the state of New York, and therefore he is moved up to the national ticket in 1900 and runs as William McKinley's vice presidential candidate in 1900 and is indeed elected. He doesn't remain vice president long, however, because Leon Czolgosz, one of the anarchists that was inspired by Emma Goldman, assassinates William McKinley in Buffalo in 1901. Thus, Theodore Roosevelt is sworn into the presidency, an office that he really came to love. He called the presidency the bully pulpit. That was a strong departure from the Gilded Age presidents who advocated laissez-faire government and not getting involved in strikes and local affairs and the economy too much. Roosevelt believed the bully pulpit should be a moral force for good, and that you should use the power of the presidency to enforce reform across the nation. He called his program the square deal, that previously Americans had had a raw deal, but now they would reach a square deal because of his reforming program. This included the Pure Food and Drug Act, which created the FDA, which for the first time the federal government would inspect food and drugs before it went to the American consumer. The Meat Inspection Act, in which federal inspectors would examine the meat that was being consumed by Americans and produced by suppliers. The Elkins Act and Hepburn Act, which provided regulation of the railroads. The Newlands Reclamation Act, which was a program of conservation, as was the creation of the National Forest Service. An event that really signaled the new power of the presidency embodied in Theodore Roosevelt was the Northern Securities case. In this case, J.P. Morgan endeavored to finance the consolidation of many railroads in the Pacific Northwest. This would create a very large new railroad trust. However, Theodore Roosevelt used the power of the Sherman Antitrust Act to prosecute Morgan as in violation of antitrust law. Morgan was outraged and couldn't believe that a president was actually standing up to him and taking him on. The case makes its way through the courts, including all the way to the Supreme Court, in which the Supreme Court actually rules in favor of the government of Theodore Roosevelt's Attorney General, and the Northern Securities Company is not created, signaling that the power of the federal government should always be greater than that of corporate interests. And Theodore Roosevelt shows he's willing to use the power of the federal government to bring reform and to prevent unnecessary consolidations in business. Another example of Theodore Roosevelt's willingness to use the power of his office included the Anthracite coal strike in 1902. Many of the coal workers had not received a raise for years, and they lived and worked in very dangerous conditions. There are really no safety regulations in the mines. They are subject to frequent accidents and cave-ins and the horrible polluted air that they are breathing in. And the mine owners would not give them a raise and not give any attention to working conditions. Therefore, the miners struck, which led to a crisis in the country because the absence of anthracite coal meant that with the coming of winter, Americans wouldn't have coal to heat their homes. President Roosevelt interceded by creating a committee and bringing the mine owners and the workers together and demanded a solution and an end to the crisis, declaring a coal famine in the winter is an ugly thing, and I fear we shall see terrible suffering and grave disaster if the issue wasn't resolved. Thus, President Theodore Roosevelt acts as a broker, as a referee between the owners and the miners. This was something unheralded, something that the Gilded Age president certainly wouldn't do. And as a result, a deal is brokered in which there would be a 9-hour workday for the miners. Representatives of workers would check the weight of the coal to ensure fairness, a 10% wage increase, and a 10% increase in the price of coal, even though the miners' union would not be officially recognized. Theodore Roosevelt is also remembered as the nation's first conservation president. This was an area of American life that had received very little attention from the federal government before President Roosevelt. But Roosevelt was a great lover of the outdoors, and therefore Congress passed several laws that restricted areas from development, and also created 5 new national parks as well as additional wildlife refuges, some of the more famous being the Grand Canyon and also Niagara Falls. Roosevelt was aided in his conservation efforts with his good friend and the first chief of the U.S. Forest Service, Gifford Pinchot. Indeed, Roosevelt and Pinchot worked closely together in order to preserve beautiful wilderness in the United States from additional industrial development. Roosevelt was reelected in 1904. In his second term, the country witnessed a very grinding panic of the nation's banking system in 1907, where there's distinctly lack of money, fluidity in the American banking system, which will raise concerns about the health of the entire banking system for the next several years. Theodore Roosevelt's foreign policy is known as the Big Stick diplomacy, in which the United States should be strong but yet seek peace. We see that in his efforts to build the Panama Canal, in which he forces the Panamanians to declare their independence and then sign over the canal zone to the United States. We also see it after the Venezuelan crisis, in which Britain and Germany threatened to invade the Dominican Republic and Venezuela because of lack of payment of debts, and therefore Roosevelt issued his famous Roosevelt Corollary that said the United States would oversee the custom houses and enforce the Monroe Doctrine. He also negotiated an end to the Russo-Japanese War in the Treaty of Portsmouth, also signed the Gentleman's Agreement with Japan in 1907 prohibiting additional Japanese immigration, and also launched the Great White Fleet. Roosevelt loved being president, but he had promised not to run again after 1904. Therefore, in many ways, his second term, he was a lame duck president. Instead, he passes over his policies to his good friend and Secretary of War, William Howard Taft. Thus, in 1908, William Howard Taft, really borrowing and being carried forward on Roosevelt's popularity, is elected the presidency again for the third time, defeating William Jennings Bryan. Indeed, Roosevelt passes off his policies and his progressive initiatives to his good friend William Howard Taft, who he believes will continue them and continue to be a progressive reformer. Roosevelt took off to Africa, launching the Smithsonian African expedition, killing many wild game and bringing them back to the United States. Meanwhile, back in the United States, William Howard Taft becomes president. Taft really never wanted to become president. He was much more concerned with the study of the law. He loved being a judge, but it was actually his wife that encouraged him to be president. He enacts a famous foreign policy in his dollar diplomacy, but there are two moves that Taft makes that signal that he's really not a progressive reformer. There is not a whole series of new laws that promote progressive reform, even though Taft called himself a progressive. He clearly does not sign one law after another that promotes reform and progressive initiatives like Roosevelt did and Wilson will after him. He does make two moves that particularly anger Roosevelt, many in the country. That includes a much higher tariff in the Payne-Aldrich tariff, and also the conflict between Gifford Pinchot and Richard Ballinger. Ballinger, who wanted to cater to large mining interests in the American West, fired Gifford Pinchot, who disapproved of those efforts, as chief of the Forest Service. As a result, Roosevelt hears about this in the newspapers during his African safari and is outraged by Taft's actions. Indeed, he returns, and discovering these things to be true, what we see is a split in the Republican Party, with those who favor progressive reform still calling for Theodore Roosevelt to return to the presidency, and those that oppose reform, who become known as the old guard or conservatives, think more in terms of a Gilded Age laissez-faire president, coalesce around William Howard Taft. This squabble between the two former friends becomes very public and is identified in the newspapers. So there's a lot of concern what will happen when the Republicans gather for their national convention in 1912. In that year, because corporate interests control much of the party apparatus, William Howard Taft is renominated to run again for president as the Republican nominee. Roosevelt and his fellow progressive reformers within the Republican Party are so outraged that they break from the main Republican Party and form their own party, the Progressive Party, better known as the Bull Moose Party, having their own convention just days later. During the campaign, Roosevelt is actually the target of an assassination attempt, which he manages to survive. The Democrats gather with great national glee for their national convention in 1912, knowing that with the Republican split, they have a good chance of capturing the White House. Therefore, they nominate the very progressive governor of New Jersey, Woodrow Wilson. The conflict between Woodrow Wilson and Theodore Roosevelt takes place also in the newspapers, as these two progressives really fight for the soul of the progressive movement, as they have two very different ideas about what progressivism is. Roosevelt calls his program the New Nationalism. The New Nationalism called for a regulation of the trusts. Woodrow Wilson calls his progressive program the New Freedom, which called for the removal of the trusts and that they would be broken up. Therefore, even though they are both progressives and advocate for a strong federal government, progressive reform, and antitrust suits against large businesses, Roosevelt and Wilson are really at different degrees of how far this progressivism will go. There is also a fourth candidate for president in this very consequential election of 1912, which is Eugene V. Debs, who is nominated by the Socialists. As a result, when the election day comes, because the Republicans are split, it ensures the election of the Democrat, Woodrow Wilson. Eugene V. Debs manages to score 400,000 votes this year in 1912. Thus, the very progressive governor of Woodrow Wilson, the son of a Presbyterian minister and a former college professor and president of Princeton University, is elected to the White House. Wilson had enacted a whole series of progressive reforms in New Jersey, and he intends to do the same as President of the United States with his cabinet. Wilson had been married to his first wife, Ellen, who bore him 3 daughters. But his wife dies during his first term as president, and very soon after, Woodrow Wilson remarries Edith Galt, who became Edith Wilson. Wilson reenacts the procedure of the president actually going to the chamber of the House of Representatives to deliver speeches. This had been a policy and a procedure that had been stopped by Thomas Jefferson, who didn't like to make public speeches. Woodrow Wilson becomes the first president since Thomas Jefferson to actually deliver his State of the Union address and other addresses directly before Congress by visiting the hall. Woodrow Wilson's presidency does succeed in passing numerous pieces of progressive reform, including the Smith-Lever Act, which provided subsidies for farmers, the Federal Farm Loan Act, the Underwood Tariff, which lowered the tariff, the Adamson Act, which imposed an 8-hour workday for railroad workers, the Federal Trade Commission, which would monitor the practices of large corporations and encourage competition, the Clayton Antitrust Act, which was a stronger antitrust act and prohibited interlocking directorates and price discrimination. However, Woodrow Wilson certainly wasn't very progressive on the national stage and actually promoted segregation in the federal workforce. As a result, with the reduction of the tariff, Woodrow Wilson also sees a need to reform the nation's banking system. Therefore, Congress passes the Federal Reserve Act in 1913, which created the Federal Reserve Board. The Federal Reserve Board and the system would create 12 national banking districts. These banking districts, with a central bank for each of the districts, would issue interest rates and also provide plenty of money in the system to make sure that there was always an adequate money supply in the system. The headquarters of the Federal Reserve and where the Federal Reserve Board meets is in Washington, D.C. In 1916, Woodrow Wilson runs for re-election. He is re-elected on the slogan, ironically, of "He has kept us out of war." As all of Europe descends into war in the fall of 1914, the United States, under the leadership of Woodrow Wilson, had managed to stay out of the war. But of course, several months after his re-election in 1916, the United States and Woodrow Wilson would call for a declaration of war and indeed enter the European War of World War I. Wilson's foreign policy is known as moral diplomacy, in which he purchased for the United States the Danish West Indies and also launched the ill-fated expedition to capture Pancho Villa. Wilson's second term is really concerned and focused on the events in Europe and eventually will lead to American involvement in World War I. World War I is the third category we can think of in terms of this unit, imperialism being the first, progressivism being the second, and now the war being the third. There are many reasons for why Europe goes to war in the fall of 1914, including nationalism or extreme patriotism, a series of military alliances that essentially mandated that nations go to war, large armies that were being formed, or militarism, competition over colonies or imperialism, and also internal conflicts, particularly in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, are going to lead to this war. The spark that really ignites the tinderbox of issues in Europe was the assassination of the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, the Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Ferdinand was visiting the city of Sarajevo in his car with his wife, and then in the course of his motorcade, he is assassinated by a young Serbian nationalist and a member of a terrorist group, the Black Hand, Gavrilo Princip. As a result of the shooting on June 28, 1914, the heir to the throne is killed, as is his wife. Princip is arrested and later will die in prison. As a result of this assassination, Austro-Hungary issues an ultimatum to Serbia that would impose martial law and a whole bunch of restrictions on Serbia's freedom. However, because Russia was interested in protecting the interests of Slavic peoples everywhere, including Serbia, and is allied with Serbia, it would mandate that Russia would go to war against Austria-Hungary to protect Serbia. But however, because Austria-Hungary is allied with Germany, Germany is forced to declare war against Russia. Because Russia is allied with France, France declares war against Germany. And when Germany attacks France through Belgium because Great Britain is allied with Belgium, Great Britain has to declare war against Germany. So this series of alliances leads to Europe's descent into the war. Of course, the coming of war is greeted with great enthusiasm all across Europe. All nations believe the war will be very short, over very quick, and the last war. It's been 99 years since there's been a great war in Europe, the Napoleonic Wars, And now, many young men rush off to war lying about their age, including a young Adolf Hitler, because they believe this is the last great war and it'll be over quickly and they don't want to miss it for the rest of their lives. World War I is different than previous wars. We call it total war because all segments of society are involved. It is not strictly the military that is concerned with the fighting of this war, but rather we see with the conscription or drafting of young men, they are required to go off to war. The policy of rationing food and supplies affected women and children on the home front. Industries are taken over by governments. There are wage and price controls. Governments spend a great amount of money on propaganda and encouraging support and patriotism for the war. Women serve in factories, and also labor unions are involved in production. The German plan for the attack on France was a plan known as the Schlieffen Plan, which involved going through Belgium, keeping the right strong, and quickly descending on Paris and capturing the capital. However, the German march through Belgium becomes known as the Rape of Belgium for the numerous atrocities and unnecessary destruction that the German army creates in Belgium. That provokes a lot of popular fury against the German army in Western states and also the United States, and antagonism against indeed German Americans. Nevertheless, the German army quickly moves through Belgium, descending towards Paris, until they are finally stopped at what becomes known as the Miracle of the Marne by English and French armies. Thereafter, both sides set up a series of trenches that extend from the British Channel all the way down to the border of Switzerland. Thus, the battle line for World War I will really be centered in the trenches that will barely move over the course of the war. World War I looks so much different than previous wars because it really is centered in much of this trench activity, in which both sides produce very deep trenches with no man's land in between in an effort to destroy each other's trenches. Indeed, these fortifications are very large and include observation trenches and also reserve supply trenches, sometimes even concrete fortifications deep underground. World War I is particularly destructive because it is industrialized warfare. We see the advent of new weapons of war during this conflict, most notably chemical warfare, gas warfare, including chlorine gas and mustard gas, which inflicted horrible wounds on the respiratory system and also the skin. Large artillery pieces often fired these gas shells, sometimes requiring a full train to move these guns up to the front to blast away at an enemy's trenches. We also see the development of tanks, primitive devices that were an effort to break through the stalemate, barbed wire, and an enemy's trench fortifications. The use of barbed wire in warfare, which was an invention on the American frontier to restrain cattle and is now used to keep men out of trenches. The development of more advanced weaponry, including the machine gun, the water-cooled machine gun by the Germans, and also submachine guns. We also see the development of flamethrowers and also the use of mines, which we first witnessed in the American Civil War. Now Welsh coal miners are used to dig these long tunnels that are used to blow up German trenches on the opposite side. We also see in World War I the first use on a large scale of aviation and aircraft. The most famous fighter pilot of World War I is on the German side, Manfred von Richthofen, the Red Baron, who famously shoots down 80 enemy aircraft. More reconnaissance was done through the use of balloons and blimps, and the British really still controlled the high seas with the development of an ironclad navy, all steam-powered, better known as the Dreadnought. The Dreadnought was a ship with very large guns that patrolled the waters off the British Isles. However, in the British Isles, of course, passenger ships from the United States continued to traverse these waters back and forth between London and New York. And on May 7th, 1915, the Lusitania, a British passenger ship that had docked in New York and taken American passengers, on its return voyage back to Great Britain, is sunk by a German submarine in the waters off the Irish coast. As a result, this is going to be one of the definitive events leading to America's involvement into the war. Because of the destruction on the Western Front, we see horrific responses of the soldiers to these conditions. We see the emergence of trench foot, which was a gangrenous condition of the feet, particularly because of the inability of soldiers to keep their feet dry, and also the emergence of what we would call a post-traumatic stress disorder, or shell shock, as it was called at the time. Indeed, by 1916, the fate of the war and the ability of the Allies, the British and French, to actually win this war is very much in doubt. The Battle of Verdun is a large attack by the German forces against French trench fortifications, leading to a horrendous loss of life. The British respond with the Battle of the Somme, which involved a massive shelling of German lines, and with the belief that the Germans were blown to bits, and therefore the British simply had to jump out of their trenches and attack. But of course, they barely make it out of the trenches and are simply gunned down. So in many ways, it seemed like Germany could be on the verge of winning the war on the Western Front. Meanwhile, they're also fighting a war to the east and gaining great successes against a dilapidated Russian army on the Eastern Front. An important telegram is intercepted by the British Foreign Office on its way to Mexico. In this telegram, the German ambassador to Mexico issues a famous offer that if the United States did join the war with the Allies against Germany, that Mexico should join Germany. And then if Germany won, then Mexico could be restored the American territories of Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona, which the United States had taken from Mexico in the Mexican Cession after the Mexican-American War. Needless to say, this did not go over very well with the American public, and it leads to greater calls and greater support for American involvement in the war. And indeed, in April of 1917, the reasons for American participation in World War I include the atrocities that the Germans committed during their campaign through Belgium, the sinking of the Lusitania, which included the deaths of 128 Americans, the economic interest that the British and French were heavily dependent on American industrial suppliers, and if the British and French lost the war, those debts would not be paid, the Zimmerman Note, which insulted American honor, and also the final straw was that the German High Command announced that they would continue unrestricted submarine warfare and sink any passenger ship traveling through the British waters of the British Isles, which would mean the deaths of additional Americans. Therefore, even though he was reelected on a slogan of "He kept us out of war" the previous November in 1916, Woodrow Wilson goes before a joint session of Congress on April 2, 1917, asking for a declaration of war. The United States government creates the War Industries Board to oversee production of the war effort, overseen by the very capable Bernard Baruch. Many domestic industries are converted to the war effort. The federal government also controls propaganda with the creation of the Committee on Public Information. At its head was the young movie producer George Creel. The CPI, or Committee for Public Information, would be instrumental in promoting what became as the 4-Minute Men, in which noted celebrities would deliver 4-minute speeches before theaters and movie houses calling for American support and participation for the war. The CPI would also produce very famous posters which encouraged patriotism, involvement, and young men to volunteer in the war effort. Also a steady diet of anti-German propaganda, and also called for Americans to join the war effort with the famous "I Want You, Uncle Sam" poster produced by James Montgomery Flagg. The U.S. Food Administration was overseen by the very capable engineer Herbert Hoover. This was an effort to get food to a starving Western Europe, as their own agricultural production had ceased because of conflict. Indeed, on the American home front, Americans are subject to rationing and events such as Meatless Mondays, Wheatless Wednesdays, and many German-American foods have their names changed to promote propaganda, including sauerkraut being changed to Liberty Cabbage, and hamburgers being changed to Liberty Steaks, and bratwurst being changed to Liberty Sausages. We also see a change in American underwear that is for the first time streamlined and mainstreamed, with the boxer brief being popular for men, and due to war rationing, the brassiere being popular for women. Thomas Crapper, the British entrepreneur, also develops the famous waterless waste preventer, or what we would identify as the toilet. The Selective Service Act is passed by Congress in 1917. This is one of the first drafts nationally in American history. Therefore, young men, on the basis of a lottery system, are drafted into the American military to go serve overseas. As a result, 4 million American men will serve in World War I, becoming nicknamed as the Doughboys, who travel overseas to the British Isles and also to France. Many of these doughboys include soldiers who will make a much greater name for themselves during World War II, including Dwight D. Eisenhower, Chester Nimitz, George Patton, Douglas MacArthur. Franklin Roosevelt was Assistant Secretary of Navy during World War I, and Harry Truman was an artillery captain. In command of all the American armies is General John Blackjack Pershing. Pershing is dealing with his own personal tragedy because his wife and 3 children had been consumed in a fire in San Francisco shortly before the war. So amidst a climate of grief, he enters a theater of complete death and indeed suffers a nervous breakdown before the war is over and is unable to continue with his command. The American arrival of troops is pivotal for the European cause at this moment because the Germans launch a massive attack hoping to win the war before the Americans are organized. Indeed, the Americans are instrumental, and a group of Marines are pivotal in turning the tide of battle at the Battle of Belleau Wood under the command of Sergeant Daniel Daly, who will later receive posthumously the Congressional Medal of Honor. Once the German advance and last-ditch attempt to overwhelm the Allies is stalled, the Allies, the British, the French, Canadians, Australians, and others, including the Americans, launch a massive offensive to win the war known as Meuse-Argonne Offensive along the Meuse River and the Argonne Forests. The American sector was towards the south, in which American units for the first time who are green initially in battle are launched into this campaign, wreaking destruction across France but nevertheless driving the German army back. One of the national heroes at this time was a poor farmer from Tennessee who initially enlisted into the army as a conscientious objector, but gradually becomes one of the war's hero, single-handedly killing 28 Germans, capturing 32 machine guns, and capturing 132 German prisoners. Sergeant York will win the Congressional Medal of Honor for his efforts. The Battle of Amiens, which saw a great use of tanks, is really the final battle of World War I. And indeed, 25 miles are taken each day by the British Army, pushing the Germans back into Germany. As a result, with Germany on the verge of starvation, the Kaiser is forced to capitulate, announce his abdication, sues for peace, and indeed an armistice is announced on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918. And indeed, the Great War ends with the German signing of the armistice at this famous railroad car located in Compiègne, France. So the Great War, the war to end all wars, the last Great War, ends on November 11th at 11 o'clock in the morning in 1918 to the huge jubilation of crowds throughout the world. The armistice, of course, is just an agreement to stop fighting, and it doesn't resolve a lot of the issues that need to be resolved after the war. Therefore, in 1919, Paris is the center of the famous Paris Peace Conference at the end of World War I. Woodrow Wilson already brings a plan of peace with him, and indeed he is greeted by millions of Parisians and Europeans, the largest assemblage of humans ever, greet President Wilson when he arrives in Paris, hoping for the peace that he promises. Wilson's plan for peace as part of his moral diplomacy is known as the 14 points. The 14 points can be remembered as first, freedom of diplomacy, freedom of the seas, freedom of trade, freedom from arms buildup, freedom for colonies, and then freedom for all of those peoples that had lived under the empires of Germany, Austro-Hungary, and also the Ottoman Empire. Thus, many countries are created, including Poland and also states in the Middle East. And the 14th point of the 14 points was the most significant, the creation of a General Association of Nations, which will be known as the League of Nations, which will resolve future conflicts and avoid war. Therefore, the leaders of the Allies, David Lloyd George of Great Britain, Vittorio Orlando, Prime Minister of Italy, and Georges Clemenceau, the fiery Prime Minister of France, and also President of the United States, Woodrow Wilson, convene in Paris and negotiate the terms of the peace. Of course, the European leaders only tacitly and calmly accept Wilson's 14 points. They are much more interested in revenge and vengeance and punishing Germany after World War I. Therefore, the Treaty of Versailles that is eventually signed in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles is really a mix of vengeance but also hope for the end of future wars. We see the enactment of reparations, a severe penalty of $31, then later $33 billion of a fine imposed on a weak and defeated Germany that they have to pay for all the costs of the war back to the Allies. Also, a new call for arms reductions in which Germany could not build a large military. Also, the very controversial guilt clause, which required the German nation to acknowledge the war was all their fault. Also, a call for self-determination, particularly for German, Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman peoples and colonies. And then also the creation of the League of Nations. So it is with great bitterness that the Germans signed the Treaty of Versailles. This peace that is imposed upon them is very vindictive. But Wilson was hopeful that the terms of the treaty, even though it created all these new nations and new resentments and redefined the map of Europe with the introduction of new countries such as Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Czechoslovakia, separate countries of Austria and Hungary, and also the completely fabricated country of Yugoslavia, and new British mandates in the Middle East, that despite all this bitterness, Wilson was a firm believer that as long as the League of Nations existed, the League would be able to resolve all future differences and prevent future wars. And indeed, many countries around the world, particularly the Allies, joined the League of Nations. Wilson faces a steep task, though, upon his return to the United States. He had not brought any of the Republicans, who had been recently elected to Congress in 1918, to join him in the peace negotiations. They felt left out and therefore felt dictated to them by this peace treaty that Wilson returns with from Paris. There's a group of Republican congressmen known as the irreconcilables, who are irreconcilable, cannot be reconciled to the terms of the peace treaty, particularly the League of Nations. They are led by Henry Cabot Lodge, who was the senator from Massachusetts and the chairman of the very powerful Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Lodge's prime objection to the Treaty of Versailles is American participation and membership in the League of Nations. The great concern of the irreconcilables is that every time there's a squabble among European monarchs, America will have to join some foreign war and send its sons off to fight on foreign battlefields. Therefore, he holds up ratification and passage of the treaty in the United States Senate. Wilson is furious. As a result, he launches a cross-country speech tour that covered 8,000 miles. He goes over the heads of Congress, goes directly to the people, appeals to them to wire their congressmen and senators to call for the ratification of the Treaty of Versailles without any changes, and including the League of Nations. Wilson embarks on an exhausting trip that included 40 speeches in 29 cities in 22 days. Coming back from the peace conference, he is completely exhausted. And Wilson, who had a history of neurological problems, suffers a massive debilitating stroke amidst one of his speeches in Pueblo, Colorado. Immediately, the rest of the tour is canceled. The president is rushed back to the White House, where he is paralyzed on his left side and bedridden. As a result, Wilson is incapacitated for the remainder of much of his presidency, not even seen in public for most of the time. Indeed, there is great speculation among historians that it is his doctor, Cary Grayson, and his wife, the First Lady Edith Wilson, who are actually the acting chief executive of the United States, that they are indeed may be forging documents that Woodrow Wilson supposedly was signing in private. As a result, Wilson never gets the United States to join the League of Nations. The League of Nations, therefore, will be weak throughout the 1920s and will not be able to prevent a future war. Wilson himself leaves in great agony from the White House and dies shortly after, and he is buried in the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C.